Good afternoon. I want to welcome everybody to the County Employee Retirement System Board of Trustees meeting. This is primarily going to be an educational session. Sheriff, if you don't mind, could you call opening statement? I'm sorry, Eric.
Yeah. This is a special meeting of the County Employees Retirement System Board of Trustees. This meeting is being broadcast via video teleconference pursuant to KRS 61826 and may be viewed by the public at the Kentucky Public Pensions Authority offices located at 1260 Louisville Road in Frankfort, Kentucky. It is also being broadcast to the public live via Facebook. If you are speaking and not appearing by video, please identify yourself before talking. If the video or audio broadcast is interrupted, we will attempt to reestablish a connection. If a connection cannot be reestablished within 30 minutes, the meeting will be adjourned and rescheduled to a later date.
Okay, thank you, Eric. And Sherry, roll call, please.
Yes, sir. Mr. Cheatham?
Here.
Dr. Carver? Mr. Foster?
Here.
Mr. Fulkerson?
Here.
Dr. Hackbart?
Here.
Dr. Milkman? Mr. O'Meara?
Here.
Ms. Pendergrass?
Here.
And Mr. Powell?
Here.
Thank you.
Okay, being quorum present, we'll move forward. Sherry, was there any public comment?
No, sir, no public comment today.
Okay. Just a couple of things just to keep you all apprised of. From my perspective, we are continuing to work on our IPS. At this point, we're still fine-tuning, and that'll be going to the investment committee here next meeting, and then refined further, and then moved on to the board. I've asked Wilshire in their training today to kind of touch on some of the areas that will be incorporated in that revised IPS statement. We did just, a few of us set in on a meeting with Wilshire and Steve Willer and investment office on a potential investment. That meeting went well, a lot of good discussion and conversation. We'll look at whether we're going to move forward with that or another direction soon there. Also want to let you know that a few weeks ago I had the opportunity to come up to Frankfort, and Jerry Powell and Lynn Hampton and I had an opportunity to have lunch and talk with Ryan Barra. Ryan has certainly hit the ground running, and it was very productive and informative conversation both ways. So really looking forward to working with him going forward as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to David Lindberg and our guests from Wilshire to begin our training, and hopefully we'll have a good lively discussion and give everybody a chance to ask questions and get as much input as we can going forward.
Great. Craig will kick us off with the document. Each of us, Craig and Chris and I, will speak back and forth throughout this, but I think what would be really good would just be a really interactive discussion with you. So anywhere, it's not a huge document. We have, I think, 14 pages, but as we go through it, just stop and have dialogue anywhere you like. So we're trying to really focus here on governance, thinking about your IPS, as you mentioned, and all of those important issues from a trustee standpoint.
Yeah, and I'll start on the next page, and Chairman's Corner there was kind of perfect intro, teeing up the fact that while we're thinking about this, we're getting ready for the IPS, which is very much a detailed outline of a bunch of different procedures, policies, and governance from a high level tends to be a bit vague. So to David's point, if you want to drill in any of these places, we're at a very high level here, and when we get to the IPS, that's when we're going to get down to the nitty gritty of pulling in, with Vicky's help, all the applicable statutes that you want to make sure that are being addressed in your IPS and in your operations. But from a high level, governance is how you're governing everything you're doing here, and not just investments, although we'll probably be speaking mostly about investments and focusing on that today. But the importance of good governance is, you can see the title of this first slide, in CERS updated their best governance practices for public retirement system report this year, highlighting the fact that this is a document that was last highlighted over a decade ago, I believe. And as we can see in the right panel here, a lot of eyes are focusing on public pensions again in the last few years after maybe a few years where you could have skirted under the radar a bit more easily. Now, unfortunately, some of the investment decisions and other decisions in public pensions are becoming more politicized. So more articles and about how politics are seeping into investment decisions. I think you guys saw this a few years ago when you put a statement in your IPS about, we're just going to lay out here how we think about proxy voting and DEI type or ESG type of considerations. We're going to do what's best for our constituents and from a pure investment standpoint, and please keep politics out of it. So you guys kind of got ahead of that a few years ago, but plenty of that going on. And why is governance so important? There's actually been studies that show there's a direct link between good, strong governance policies and documentation and better performance in the long run. But I think it's more about risk management than anything else. If you have a good set of procedures and everyone's on the same page, strong communication, good documentation, it leads to a better process and better identification, understanding, and management of risks. So as you can see in the points on the left, I mentioned increasing politicization of investment decisions, which is an emerging risk. And like I said, governance is more than just investments, but that's where we'll primarily be focused today. But this good governance goes to all the different departments that the board oversees. And if we move to the next page.
Maybe I'm going to jump in just for a second before we go to the next page, but this piece about all eyes on public pension funds. And you can see that every article you read in the pension press strikes up some big discussion. And there are so many things that get attacked. One, a big one, and I just mean attacked in general, not even a positive or negative, but fees. Constantly, legislators, politicians wanting to know about the fees you're paying. You've seen a lot of articles about alternative investments and a big push for, in many states, why are you doing all these alternative investments? These fees, are high. Incentive-based comp. All of these things come into the press quite often, and as we get through this today, I think the stronger your own governance is, the better positioned you are to respond to these, because some of these pushes may be very legitimate, some may be really off the reservation, and the stronger your governance is and the better planning you have for just outlining what you're doing helps you to speak to a lot of those issues. We see this in some other states where there's just so much, back and forth, and you need to have good governance to be able to respond.
That's David, a great segue to the question that I wanted to ask Craig about politicization. And do you guys see across the other systems that you work with, because more politics is being injected into the decisions that boards make, that part of governance is the identification of, say, a legislative person who is responsible for being the go-through for those kinds of legislative issues? Do you see a move toward that?
I'd say there's clearly a connect in that way, in terms of just understanding for a board of trustees to understand who are the legislative people that are going to be driving some of these issues and what's their connect, whether it's to your board or some other, you have an oversight body too with your PPOB, and some of those organizations. Yes, like just knowing where are these connects and where are these discussions likely to come from.
Let me interject, because I hate to ever follow social media, but I do from time to time, and I think it's incumbent upon us to be real clear so that people understand what our fee cost structure in essence is. And I'm not looking at an investment by investment blow, but Steve, I think I've heard you mention it in a meeting. I know it's readily available in the annual reports, but just for the public record, our overall cost of operation, if I am remembering correctly, is somewhere below 0.5%. Is that correct, Steve?
Yep, that you are correct.
So, I just want to put that out there because I have seen people want to make statements that it's 1.5 and 2 points and 3 points. And, the thing that gets lost in that, even at 0.5 point, when you cite the actual dollar amount, it sounds like a huge amount of money, and it is.
Yeah.
But it is a huge amount of money because we are dealing with a even larger amount of money. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there so that it was on the record and we could put that into perspective as we move forward with the conversation.
And I would
Hey, Lyle, I appreciate that. And also, I think to emphasize exactly what you said, part of that governance is transparency. And I think this board and the investment committee and KPPA in general has done a great job with the transparency and the information that's available on the website. Some very detailed, probably more detailed than some people want to look at, but all of that information is available on the website and updated at least on a quarterly basis.
I was just going to add to that. When we think about the implementation of the portfolio, and part of what the board's responsibility is to decide where that risk budget is going to be taken. Because not all markets are created equal. There are efficiencies and inefficiencies in the marketplace. And we've worked with staff, and I think it's a fairly well embraced philosophy that in markets where they're efficient, we want to be going into more of a passive type of investment, or maybe an enhanced index type of perspective. And those fees are going to be much lower. But in inefficient markets, where we do think we have the ability to add a lot of value, we want to be aggressive with our risk budget there. We want to take more risk budget, which means you're going to pay higher fees potentially to those managers. But the reason we're paying higher fees is because we think there's a lot of conviction and more probability in the long run to add value.
Well, and that goes to the other point that I wanted to make. Yeah, we certainly don't want to be the most costly pension fund out there. But at the same time, you can't sacrifice return, to say, you can't sacrifice $1 to save 10, or in this case, just the reverse. You're sacrificing $10 just because you wanted to save $1 in fees. And that when it comes to investment community and different asset classes, that is certainly a big issue to have to keep in mind.
Yeah, Steve's made this point on several calls. Questions come to him a few times, and when your performance fees are high, people want to make a news headline might be focused on the fee level, but you're paying the high performance fee because of the high performance that drove it. So again, there's no amount of communication and strong governance that will stop people from trying to make a news article headline catchier than it probably deserves to be. But if your stakeholders are well informed, and like Steve said, the information's out there and the people that really care to know have access to it, that goes a long way to making the people that are the key stakeholders aware that those types of articles can be largely ignored.
You mentioned that this whole issue of governance can be an important part of dealing with these external pressures. Have you noted any particular trend nationwide in terms of reaction to ineffective, that's almost become common pressures and criticism and so forth? Has that led to adjustments in strategies and so forth that you observed, or have basically the public entities been able to act rationally and avoid reacting?
I think, going back to the example of your IPS a few years ago addressing ESG, we've seen a few clients say, here's how we do things. We just want to make you understand that it's part of our investment process, and we're not trying to advance any agenda. We're making investment decisions based on investment inputs and considerations. So
As
we've seen other
fiduciaries,
clients
that's-
do that.
And we're going to talk about fiduciaries a little bit later and the prudent man rule and all the things that go along with being a fiduciary. And that's exactly, from a governance standpoint, what we've seen many plans or even states push back on from even potential legislative pressures to say, we're going to do what's best for our constituents because that's what we are empowered to do.
And Merle, part of that, to the part of your question, you said anything common that we see. This isn't new to you. You've seen this in the press a bunch of times. But one of the most common things that I think we read is the pressure on funds with private investments. And it's, to what Lyle said, it's a headline-making issue. You paid X number of dollars in fees, get rid of the private investments, et cetera, et cetera. Most of it, we have talked about this numerous times, most of those articles do not attach the performance of those private investments to the fees that were paid. So many of the articles just talk about the fees. And I think in terms of reactions, we've seen both types. We've seen some pension plans just hold strong and make their case and continue doing what they're doing. And we've seen other ones change course. So, don't know all the details, but you assume that behind the scenes, the pressure is probably so great that they, maybe they threw in the towel or, however they thought about that. But we've seen both reactions.
Yeah, I really appreciate the interactive nature of this conversation as we start. And I just want to point out that 2 legislative sessions ago, in House Bill 236, the legislature spoke very clearly about ESG. And though we had mentioned that previously in our IPS, that will not be a part of our IPS going forward based upon the statute that was passed 2 legislative sessions ago.
All right, so carrying on, if we move to the next page, like I said, we'll largely focus on in the investment part of governance today. To do so, I want to think about, from a very high level, the investment decision-making framework, which we see on this page, and then we'll go into a bit more detail. Is that down the side of this inverted pyramid here, you can see several different lenses of risk, that, as we like to call them. So from the very top level, when we're thinking about governance, a board has to decide how far down this spectrum they want to be involved and to which degree. So the board has to handle the top level, making sure that the objectives are clear and understood. And in this case, your objectives, are to have at the bureau's level, or to have the funds to pay out the amounts that you promised to your constituents, right? They put in the years of work and they're depending on these cash flows. So your number one objective is to make sure you can meet those, pay those promises. And then from there, the biggest driver, as we said, is we went through the asset allocation processes. This is the biggest driver of the performance that's hopefully going to support those, the growth of assets to make those cash flows. And then you can see here we get down into investment structure, manager selection, and implementation. A board, even beyond investments, has a number of things that you're responsible for and overseeing. And every board has to decide how far down this ladder you want to go in terms of being involved in the decision, or being delegating authority and then being informed afterwards. And if you're going to delegate authority and be informed afterwards, how is information reported to you so that you're still making sure you're meeting your obligation to be keeping an eye over what's happening. So that's something that's going to come up in multiple places when we do get to that IPS conversation. Is you're not expected as the board to do everything, but you have to be clear about where you want to delegate authority and how you're going to keep an eye on what's happening, because it all comes under your watch at the end of the day, even if you've delegated the ability for someone else to carry things out, whether that's the IC or down to the staff level. It makes operational sense for certain things to be delegated, and at a certain point, though, it's all about what the board is comfortable with and has the capacity to handle in-house.
I think a point to that too is that if you look at this upside down triangle, which we show this in every asset liability study that we do, because the purpose of this is to show where are the biggest decisions around the management of any fund. And we all know that asset allocation decision, top level, number one decision. But what you can think about as trustees is also how you govern and where you spend the most of your time from a governance standpoint. Line that up with the investment, portfolio construction, and where are those biggest issues. You can always be thinking about that as you're thinking about what do we do, what does the investment committee do, what does your staff do, what do your outside service providers like us do, and just be thinking about that, and you're governed significantly at the top for sure.
So I'm not going to read through all the bullet points, but like I said, you can see the risks down the side there. And as we move to the next page, just to talk about those in a bit more detail, you can see we, on page 5, have in a different color there the organizational risks. So that's behavioral and shortfall. Shortfall being the main one, as I mentioned before. You want to meet those obligations. So falling short, not having the money to make those distributions is the key top level risk. But behavioral is one that ties directly to governance. If you don't have strong and well-documented procedures, you open up new levels of risk because things can slip through the cracks, and that's definitely an area where legal risk comes into play, and as well as reputational risk. If you have tighter, stronger governance, you can never eliminate those risks, but you can really limit them to the hopefully the least amount possible. But then as we move around the investment risk, we have the other ones that you think about the drawdown risk when we went through asset allocation, talking about the volatility of the different asset allocation options that we showed. So as we cut risk, we're giving up some return, but we're also trying to manage that drawdown and volatility risk.
Let me ask you a question. If I didn't ask, I forget. We talked about in our IPS about asset classes and asset allocation and that sort of thing. One of the things that we've never directly addressed or put it in terms of a number is that risk level, whether put it in the form of standard deviation or what. Is that something that you see or don't see ever addressed or put in IPS?
I've seen IPSs talk about it. The thing is, it's a range, right? Like you're not gonna say we're targeting an 11% risk portfolio. You're generally gonna find a range, and most ranges are gonna be somewhere between that 10 and 13%, maybe somewhere in that ballpark. I think where it gets addressed is what's the risk appetite of the board, and it basically comes down to what is the maximum amount of pain you're willing to kind of endure in a market stressed environment. Because if you have a 15-16% risk portfolio, you have to be willing to deal with that drawdown during times of stress. If we go back to a 2008-2009 scenario, our equity return assumptions from a risk perspective are closer to that 17% level. That would have meant if you have a really high equity allocation during that time, you were probably going to lose somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 50% of your portfolio during that time. That might not be an appetite or something that the board is willing to take under. So if you were to say, well, we're not going to be able to endure a 40 to 50% loss, but we can suffer in the worst case, the 2+2-3 standard deviation event, we can handle having a 25% drawdown. Those are things that we can model into the portfolio and find, where you're really going to sit on the efficient frontier to minimize the chances of going above that type of drawdown for you.
And I tell my clients, I get paid to manage risk. I don't get paid to manage money per se. But it's just pure math. I don't remember, Steve, you may remember off the top of your head, what this last correction that we had in the market a year or two ago, what was the portfolio down, like 8% maybe, something like that?
Yeah, between 7 and 8%. And I think exactly that point. Sorry, Lyle, didn't mean to jump in, but I think that's part of the consideration that's done with the asset allocation. I think that's, as opposed to targeting actually a risk number, but that's more of a consideration of that where you derive your asset allocation. I think we can report different metrics to Wilshire's point, but ultimately it's that asset allocation decision that's going to derive the amount of risk that you're embedding in a portfolio.
The point, I guess the point I'm trying to make is, if we had an 8% drawdown, we've got to have a 10+% return to just get back to break even. So, knowing what our drawdown parameters are, I think maybe worth a discussion, Dr. Hackford, to as a secondary metric.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It is a great point. And we, in the asset liability work, this often gets overlooked by any clients and trustees. We have all these projections and simulations, and we show what we expect. And the expectation is the 50th percentile of a distribution of outcomes. Lyle, what you've talked about is what's the sequence of returns. And we're well aware of that issue, and that's where that drawdown risk comes into play, because while you might have an expectation over 10 or 20 years of X, the sequence could be it's an unlimited number of possibilities. And what does a year with a 15 or 20% sell-off to the portfolio mean for you? And for every fund, there's a different answer to that question, because a lot of that is also tied to what's your need to generate cash flow throughout every quarter and every year. If a fund has benefit payments that match contributions and they essentially have to generate no cash flow for extended periods of time, they can take a different level of risk than a fund that might need to generate 5, 6, 7% of its asset value every year in the form of cash flows.
And also your funding ratio is important in that consideration, right?
For sure.
In terms of where you are, in terms of how I like to think of it to some extent as sort of a rainy day fund. In reality, it's a reserve, and so forth, beyond just the fact it's a revenue generating portfolio. So.
As we look at this kind of wheel up on the screen as well, we're talking about these risks are isolated from each other. They're not necessarily isolated, right? Because the behavioral risk is tied to the drawdown risk as well. Right. If you think about just rebalancing of your asset allocation, or my peers are doing this because we're guilty of this as well. We show you your performance compared to other pension plans, public pension plans that might be greater than $1 billion. But the reality is every one of those funds have different goals and benefit streams, liability payments, and they have different risk appetites. So while we show you against your peers, you also have to realize you're not invested the same as every one of your peers. You have a very specific asset allocation that's targeted for your specific liability.
I guess the interesting question is, how do you establish your risk appetite?
That's a board level decision. That's going to be a board level, and it has to be how much of the downside generally are you willing to?
Is that just a value, or just a feeling?
Well, but I think
is there a way to?
It's a process, and we help with that as we go through those studies with the board. It is a board decision, and we can help guide that by looking at all these things we're talking about. Short-term periods, what's the potential for asset value loss? What does that mean for your plan to recover from that? Long-term, what do the expected returns look like with a given risk level relative to your ability to grow your funded ratio? All of these pieces come into that.
And again, I think your funding ratio would be a major factor in determining
that's your goal.
And,
right.
And to Steve's office side, there's things that you can do to hedge that downside. Mm-hmm. And to what degree are we either making use of them, not making use of them, or prepared to be able to make use of them.
Well, the nice part about being a public pension fund is you have a much longer investment horizon than most plans. So you have a longer duration, if you will, with your portfolio. You can weather the storm in a downturn. Whereas you look at maybe a foundation or endowment who has a very different objective and goal to the public pension plan system, they may be hurt by different drawdowns in a different way than you will. So it goes back to every fund is different, and your governance and your policies have to be set up. Think of them as bumpers down the bowling alley to keep you going down, to make sure in the long run you are set up for success.
And this type of fund is dynamic because we're receiving funds and it's perpetual, right? Which is, I think, your point, right?
Yes.
If it's a private foundation for a particular purpose, where originally funded from a major grant, the funding there becomes much different, and the management there is different than in this kind of an environment that we're involved in, because this potentially goes on for decades, right?
Yeah.
But hasn't our experience really showed where the board's risk appetite is? Because every quarter, Steve is, and very rightly so, very proud to talk about our Sharpe ratio, our risk-weighted return. So we get a lot of return for the risk that we accept. And given that, I'm curious whether or not, just as a general statement for our IPS consideration, what you guys would think about something like, we want to be in the upper quartile, the first quartile of risk-weighted return. So that we make that statement every quarter, but there's no place where we formally state that as a board, that that's what we're concerned about doing, but our experience says that we are.
To Chris's point, I don't know if in the IPS you'd want to reference peers just because they're going at it with different objectives, cash flows. So it might not be a fair comparison. I think it's totally fair to say, in addition to focusing on a return because we have this assumed rate we're trying to hit, we're trying to achieve that very efficiently. So we want to target Sharpe ratios or information ratios of X, Y, Z.
Yep. Great.
But to the point about how do you, Merle's point about how do you decide what that risk level is, I don't think anyone comes at it and says we want this level of volatility. I think every asset allocation process you go through and hear different voices looking at the different asset allocation policies they have to choose from and steering the conversation and then finally voting on one. It plays out that you find out what that risk tolerance is, and it changes over time, because a few years ago, when our assumptions for fixed income were much lower, you had to have a tougher conversation about how much extra risk do we want to take as our expected return keeps coming down. Do we keep ramping up risk to try to continue to hit a return objective, or do we accept the fact that we might fall short of that return objective for a period of time until the market gives us a better risk-adjusted chance of achieving it without putting ourselves too far out on the ledge?
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Do you all, Wilshire, have the ability to, I know you have the ability to give us your models as far as expected return on risk and all that. Do you all have the ability to back test against, basically stress test that portfolio against, say, for example, the financial crisis?
Oh, absolutely.
I think it would be helpful in putting it in terms that our board can understand, to say, all right, with this asset allocation, this is what would have happened in 08, 09, from a dollar figure.
Right.
We even take that a step further. As part of the simulations that we put forth in an ALS study, we have different economic regimes. So you might think of an economic regime as just saying like a base or trend growth number, and then you have maybe an expansionary growth, and maybe you have a slight recession, and you have an inflationary environment, and we keep a matrix of probabilities between moving into those different economic regimes, so that when we simulate, we're not just simulating, hey, we're going to go base trend the whole time. You do get little shocks to the simulation here and there. So ultimately, if you have a higher risk portfolio if you end up in that recessionary environment, it's going to take a larger, hit to the portfolio. Whereas if you have a more, I'll call it conservative or risk efficient portfolio, when you move into those, you're not going to see as large of a hit because you are more diversified across your asset classes.
I think some ability to visualize these impacts is really important.
Yeah.
I was going to share an experience in terms of these kind of fuzzy number values, or risk. What's your risk preference? Back in 1980, a long time ago, I was budget director, and we had the challenge of deciding what our debt capacity was. This was probably at the very start when states began to think about debt capacity. That's a pretty fuzzy number, right?
Mm-hmm. 18% interest rates at the time.
And so the question was, how do you go about determining that? It's sort of the same concept, right? And so what we did, we looked back over the previous 10 to 15 years and determined what percent of the general fund budget had been allocated to debt service. The theory that, in effect, legislators had made choices between current expenditures versus long-term debt and the resulting debt service that would have to be paid from each subsequent budget. And we found that to be about 6%. So we established this policy that the debt capacity for the Commonwealth of Kentucky was 6% of the general fund revenue. It was never put in statute. That policy lived to the present time.
Wow.
And that policy probably would have been, you would have had a bigger risk appetite as the interest rates declined, because you could have taken on more debt at a lower fee, and you could have refinanced
It's part of the
debt.
calculation, because the metric is the debt service payment.
Mm-hmm.
So when interest
Is that
rates
the
decline,
6%, Merle? The 6% of the budget for debt service
6%.
payment? Yeah.
So when interest rates declined, you could take on more debt, but you still stayed within that debt capacity calculation. And the rating agencies, they bought right into that, thought that's great. And we didn't have a rate reduction, even though in 1981, 1982, most states were having significant reductions in their debt ratings. But we had that debt capacity calculation.
It was a self-adjusting.
Right,
number.
right. And so the question is, how do we determine what that capacity was? And we look back in terms historically, what seemed to be the appetite to trade off current expenditures for meeting debt service commitments.
Mm-hmm.
And that policy still exists today.
Yeah. Wow.
In our case, it's weighing potential loss against
Exactly.
future
Right.
gain.
Right.
For potential gain.
And so some visualization of that, I think, could be helpful in determining, what's our, as a board or as trustees, what are we willing to accept in terms of taking risk and so forth. I think what you were just suggesting can be helpful in terms of what would be the impact under different scenarios.
And when we think of the ALS study that we did for you, we were focused in on a very small piece of the efficient frontier. So in essence, we had taken the board's prior experience in portfolios and we had zoomed in kind of to those risk levels, if you will. But we could certainly go back to that efficient frontier and we could find portfolios at the lower end of the frontier and portfolios at the higher frontier that probably weren't going to be investable or something that the IC or the board was going to pass, but we could certainly simulate those, 1, 3, 5, 10, 20 years out in the future, and you would see the difference in distributions and what the risk, benefits or drawbacks were of each of those portfolios.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just to add, to that, like that could be complemented with this visualization issue that you're referring to. And wow, you talked about, pick the credit crisis. I mean, we've done that before, and it's really interesting because we spend most of our lives with forward-looking projections, and then you have a big market sell-off. And all of us were like, where does this fit into the forward-looking projections? And the 2008 credit crisis was between a 2 and 3 standard deviation event. That drawdown was significant. So it's a great way to just, that's only one scenario, and sequence of returns means probably never have that exact scenario again, but we'll have a scenario. And so that can be a good way to just complement. You know, you can take that, you can take, 2020 COVID, we've done some things with that. You can take all these different events and just provide those. Those are real, sometimes for board members, that's probably pretty good because those are real life situations.
It can help them visualize, okay?
Yeah.
Talk about what's our risk tolerance.
Yeah.
Well, we got to visualize what the implications of different risk tolerances can be, and that can be helpful, I think.
And here we've kind of focused on drawdown a bit, and I'm going to turn it over to David for the next page. But these different types of risk, it's just, we like to highlight that there's different types of risk you should be considering, not just drawdown. But like I said, I'll hand it over to David to talk a bit more. Risk is not always it's not purely a bad thing. If you weren't going to take any risk, you wouldn't get any return. So you have to consider all these risks, but then how you think about these risks goes a little bit deeper than just saying we want to avoid all risks. That's not the case.
Right. Well, and if we go to that next slide, these are risk beliefs that we have as a firm as it pertains to institutional portfolios. And I think you can tie this right into the governance issue that we're talking about today. The first one, risk should be compensated. Well, that's a pretty easy statement to make, and anyone would probably agree, sure, I want to be paid for the risk that I take. But I think, to tie this to governance, as you think about where you want to spend time and how you want to govern, this issue of risk being compensated, it's at all levels of the portfolio. So think again about that upside down triangle and asset allocation. And we've talked about to get, XYZ expected return is going to come with a certain level of risk. We want to make sure that's appropriate compensation. We were talking about measuring that from a Sharpe ratio standpoint, et cetera. But all the way down through the portfolio, there are risks that are taken. So when you leave the asset allocation perspective, you get to asset class structure and what are you doing in the U.S. equity portfolio? What are you doing in the non-U.S. equity portfolio? Each one of these areas involves risk decisions again. And so I think, and then down to manager selection and implementation and just everything that's going on. So I think what you can, think about in terms of these risks, it's almost like, think of how an organization sets a mission statement. And then as you go forward, generally, all the things you're deciding and the projects you're doing, and et cetera, somehow tie back to that mission statement. This is what we said we had for our mission. These are our goals and objectives, is what we're doing, tying back to that. You can think similarly with risk and just making sure that the compensation for risk is commensurate, each step of the way through the process. And that comes, these other points on here, we've touched on a bunch of them, but the downside risk, the behavioral risk, same thing. Are we taking on a policy that we can afford that certain level of downside risk that would come with that? So those are the things they easily, I think, get, pushed aside in discussions. I don't mean with you here, but with any board and with any group of trustees going through an asset allocation process or an investment structure process. It's easy for those to be sort of glanced at and moved on from. But if you spend time, again, where can you govern the best is spending time on those high level decisions and being aware of what risk you're taking, what you've decided, and how you want to take that risk, and that will come on to the IPS in a little bit and talk about these, but making sure we've identified who's making decisions around those risk areas, et cetera, so that you know, and you can have a feedback loop into your process for that. So it's taking all those risks and thinking about that from a governance standpoint. We mentioned market timing can be dangerous, sure. Market timing is very difficult. Tactical positioning of the portfolio relative to its targets. we all know it's really hard to win at that. So does that mean you never do it? Probably not. But what does it mean about how you do it? And then just govern that. We've talked about rebalancing ranges around asset allocation targets. That's one place where you can be proactive about how much of a range you want to have around these targets. And you can be proactive about, do we want to intentionally take tactical viewpoints at any point in time relative to our targets? And then if so, what's it take for us to say yes to that? How compelling is the opportunity? Rather than letting those things just become sort of a byproduct of how everything's being managed. So these are all areas where governance is important, much more so than just XYZ manager selection, but those kinds of issues.
I was just saying on the market timing front, one of the reasons we believe market timing doesn't work is because you might have a position today that, whether you believe equity markets are undervalued or overvalued, you take that opposite position, or you take that position. You have to get that call right twice. You have to get in at the right time, but you also have to get out at the right time. And that's where most people fail. They might be able to get in at the right time, they don't get out at the right time, and that's why market timing in the long run is not something Wilshire fundamentally believes in. One of the areas you can go back to, the credit crisis, where we actually did make a tactical decision, was when spreads became quite wide in 2009. Our high yield assumption actually grew quite a bit when we looked at the interquarter macro data that fed our assumption, and we actually moved into high yield. We thought that was a really good place to be. We experienced all of that return that we were projecting over a 10-year time period in a term of like 6 months. So that was a tactical risk on into the high yield market. And then, once people were able to harness those returns, now you could say you got in at the right time, but you also had to get out at the right time to be able to truly harness all that return. That's a very hard thing to do.
Yeah, and another more recent example right here with your own portfolio. You made an intentional decision to be short duration when rates were near zero. And so, the point is that the way we often think about this is take these risks when they're the most compelling. And that's an example of one where when rates were near zero, the trade was totally asymmetric. It was, you had such a higher level of conviction of being able to be successful with that position. So it paid off for you. So those are the kinds of things just to think about with being tactical in terms of positioning, and how often do you want to do that and how do you want to do it?
And from a governance perspective, who makes those decisions? Is that something that the board is going to delegate to the investment committee, to staff? Is it something they want to ratify? Those are the types of governance pieces that you need to think about, and they should be living within your IPS, how that's going to actually function from a working investment management process.
But I think the further, in addition to the market timing comment, is that risk has to be active and not passively taken. And your point to tactical, what you want, you don't want tactical to morph into structural, right? I mean, that's the danger of taking tactical positions, as we've seen, and that's why that risk has to be actively managed and not passively accepted.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. So these next two pages, we're gonna step in soon to some of the points about an IPS and how we tie all this in, but just rules for institutional investors. We've really said a lot of this, but as a governing body, board of trustees, investment committee, focusing on the decisions that matter the most, again, back to just that upside down chart, make sure you're governing on these most critical things, and getting that in writing, getting that in your policy documents. That's the key. As we started this conversation with how you have the press, you have legislature, you have all kinds of pressure on you, and the more of this that you've defined in your policy documents, every day is easier. It's just easier to deal with those pressures, the more of this that you've defined. And in the, category of risk, we talk here, control risk through diversification. I'll just make an additional point about that. We've talked about this in all the asset allocation work that we've done. Risk or diversification is not just diversifying capital. It's truly diversifying risk. You can have 10 or 12 asset classes and feel that, and many funds do, and feel that they're really well diversified, and basically they have something that is 0.99 correlated to a 70-30 portfolio. So we step into a much deeper level on risk, as you know, from going through the asset liability work and looking at what is actually driving the risk and trying to diversify those drivers a bit. The 2008 credit crisis just hurt so many institutional investors based on this issue alone. They were capital diversified, but they weren't risk diversified. So just measuring that every time we go through that work, we measure that and we show you those metrics. And it's not easy. It's not easy to get all that risk, evenly allocated. But you can make progress in that direction where you'll be able to hold up better in some of these sell-offs and some of these difficult market environments. But the buck stops with the board. The next slide. This whole thing is about, this whole discussion today is about this. It's governance, and you are the trustees, and this is where it all comes back home. So we'll talk a bunch about the IPS and getting these things into documentation. Is probably the most important part on this page, is having that framework established, having the IPS addressing what your objectives are, what your intentions are. Even we talked about Sharpe ratio. You could have an objective, maybe not to relative to peers, but you could have just an absolute objective. We want to be paid X for the amount of risk that we take. And so if that's an objective, we work towards that, we policy it, we talk about it, and then measure it. Make sure all these things that are set as objectives are measured, and there's a feedback loop coming back to what's the intent, and then how are we doing relative to that intent. So that's, all of these things are critical. We've talked a little bit about there's responsibilities, but just making a decision about where each of these responsibilities is held, who has it, and then who's accountable. The board, the investment committee, the staff, us, everyone who is part of your team should be clear, like, where are you accountable? And then have feedback to show, here's how we're doing, here's how this has worked or hasn't worked. And so you're in a position at the trustee level, you're in the highest level of governance for this fund, and be in a position to know the answers to those things.
We'd love to be able to tell you this is how it should be done, but there isn't a one size fits all. So it's sort of like the asset allocation process. We could look at another fund that looks similar to yours in terms of funded status and cash flows, and based on the risk tolerances of the people that make up the board there, they could potentially land on a different policy than you did, because it comes down to the trade-offs that the board members are comfortable making, whether it's the asset allocation or the delineation of responsibility and authority. It really comes down to what works for you guys. But once you figure that out, put it in writing and constantly be going back and checking and making sure we're actually living up to what we said we were going to be doing. That's a key part of having some sort of feedback loop, to be making sure that those decisions still apply, but also that they're being followed.
One of the points I would make on that is you always want to be able to benchmark yourself against somebody or some entity or whatever. Benchmarking yourself against them and following them are not the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
If you're following them, then you're assuming they're right. And I don't know that any of us want to make that assumption.
Yeah, that's a great point. I know we've said this in your board room many times, and we say this all the time when we present those universe comparisons. They're interesting data. It's good to know, what you're working at. There's 400 other funds around the country working at something similar. It's good to know how they look, how you look relative to them. But we often say that is not your benchmark, because There are all different strategies in there, all different objectives, different cash flows, everything.
This may be totally off subject. I'm just curious from your all's perspective and what's going on in the industry to what degree Reg BI plays in this.
Reg BI.
The changes to the fiduciary standard that's
Oh.
coming out of Labor Cabinet.
Right. Well, there's always, so a lot of those will start with ERISA plans. And we always, those are meaningful, we think, whether you're an ERISA plan or not. And so, it's good to get what comes out of that process and think about what does that mean for a public pension plan just as much as what does it mean for a
They
corporate.
basically have done just exactly that. They've extended that standard
Yeah.
across, outside of ERISA and into any kind of retirement plan.
Yeah. Right. So, every bit of that, it can drive your investment policy statement, depending on what the issues are. And if there are things that you need to comply with or should comply with, it absolutely could drive its way into an IPS.
Okay.
Mr. O'Meara had his hand up.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Well, I don't know. I don't know how to ask my question, but I'm getting conflicted on how to think about risk. You keep talking about the 2008 and 2009 market upheaval, and yet we're supposed to also have a 30-year investment outlook that would acknowledge ups and downs
Sure.
in the market. So I'm not sure how that is helping me as a trustee decide what kind of risk I can take. Because if I'm trying to protect myself from a huge 50-year event,
Right.
then I'm going to get super conservative. And if I'm going to try to ride the market and ride investments over a 30-year horizon, then I understand that I hope a 50-year event doesn't occur during those 30 years, but it might.
Sure.
So I'm trying to weigh those two signals that are coming here as a trustee.
That's a great point. So first of all, we didn't mean to overemphasize that 50-year event that we had in 2008-9. It's simply an interesting observation. As you know from our work, we focus on forward-looking metrics, but these are real life stories that we can also say, this is what that would have looked like. But Bill raises a great point. It's a balance. You have to balance in terms of the risk you want to take. You can't, most institutional funds like yours cannot afford to position for that event, because that would be exactly what you'd say. You'd be way conservative. And it's a balance of getting through that event with being able to fund these liabilities over the next 30 years, the next 50 years. It's a total balance. So it's good data to see that, but it's also, we can simulate that and see that looking forward, and just as that you talk about it and understand, when you're making an investment asset allocation policy decision, A versus B, you can look at the different impact each of those has on those down markets, as well as the ability to fund these liabilities long term. And it becomes to some degree, a qualitative discussion, but it's a balancing effort in there. And by no means would we suggest that you position for that event, because the balance you have to have is long term. You need to pay every last benefit that you have
out of this plan, and you need to have asset growth to do that.
It strikes me also that, in effect, what we're also eventually talking about is the arc. That if you have a downturn, it's going to potentially affect the arc. Correct?
The actuarial return?
Contribution.
Yeah, sure, sure, yeah, the contribution,
Because if
sure.
your portfolio
Oh, yeah,
drops,
sure, yes,
that's going to be the fiscal impact
yes,
on
Right.
the sponsors of that
That's
fund,
right.
right?
yes.
So that's going to be the impact. Eventually, that arc is going to be determined throughout the entire lifespan of the fund. And so that's another way of looking at
Yes.
that
Yes.
responsibility, because that's going to be the real impact. Otherwise, if you're 40 or 50 or 80, 60% funded, the beneficiaries aren't going to recognize any changes in their return, in their benefits, even though you have fluctuations, right?
Yep.
The fiscal impact is going to be on potentially on the ARC, and the employer's contributions may have to increase if that portfolio continues to stay.
Right.
And I think going to Bill's point, and we focused on drawdown, but the other risk on that page was behavioral. And that's what, when you get into a market event like whether it's a financial crisis, COVID, whatever, how you react to it from a behavioral standpoint will dictate how well you either do or don't recover from that event.
It sure will.
That's
And
a great point.
Yeah.
And it leads right in. I'm going to take that as a lead in to the IPS here.
Okay. Well, the second point I want to make is when you are cash flow positive, that's one thing. When you're cash flow negative, that's the other part of the equation that has to be factored in when those events happen.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
If we move to the next slide, we've had a lot of great discussion here, everything that revolves around governance, but when we talk about the IPS, which, as Mr. Cheatham referenced, we are in the process right now of drafting revisions to kind of getting some internal comments, and that is going to be brought to the investment committee here in the near future. This is really your living, breathing document, and it's your governance documentation. It is going to give you all of those guardrails, and it is the document that's going to essentially be your Northern Star or your investment manual. So if you have a new trustee coming into the system, or if there was another investment staff member brought onto the system, they can read this document and have a good understanding of what the governing principles of this fund are. So when we go through and kind of look at some of the bullet points on here, and we've actually hit on a lot of these so far, which just means we've had great discussion back and forth to this point. So I want to keep that going. But when we talk about articulating investment philosophies and long-term investment objectives, we all know that our investment objectives are to meet those beneficiary payments. We talked very early on about fees, and being something that's critically important to the fund. There is sometimes external noise in the way of publications or articles that are written about investment management fees being paid to a certain manager over a particular investment. And just to reiterate that, I think that's a philosophy or a belief that should be embedded within your document as to what are your active and passive stances on investment, and what is the risk budget of the portfolio, and how are we going to ultimately target implementing different asset classes. There are some asset classes that you don't have the option for a passive investment in. There is really, at least today, no passive investment for private equity. You can't just go out and get access to private equity. Now, there's ETFs and things that are in the talks, and maybe that will be something you can look at, but we truly believe that is an area that active management can add significant value there. But it comes at a cost. They do have higher fees than a large cap and core enhanced strategy do. You are paying for that premium of return, if you will. But that should be something that, if the board truly believes in it, it should be documented and it should live in your IPS. Craig talked a little bit about the delineated duties and responsibilities of whether it's the board, subcommittees, the investment committee, staff, consultants, managers, investment managers. We all have our own duties in managing the portfolio, those should be delineated. We should be talking about them in the IPS. We talk about the asset allocation and the implementation plan, again, going back to that comment of active versus passive. We talk about putting the asset allocation in there. Rebalancing ranges is something else that matters a lot. We were talking about path mattering. Well, if you want to go back to the GFC of 2008, 2009, or even more recently, 2020, COVID, we all saw what COVID did to the economy very quickly. There was a big hit in equity markets, but it was very short-lived. And I will tell you, we had conversations with staff, and I remember talking to Joe Gilbert very specifically. Equity markets are drawing down, but he was maintaining the rebalancing back to the portfolio so that when markets recovered, you got to participate in that recovery. If you took a passive approach to rebalancing, you would not have recovered in the same way that you were able to. So having that rebalancing strategy in there, well documented, and making sure you don't let that behavioral risk kind of dominate during times of market stress, being able to adhere to that rebalancing strategy is really one of the things that we think makes up good governance and helps a plan like yours set themselves up for long-term success. One of the things, there was a paper that our head of investment research wrote over a decade ago, and we actually revitalized it right around COVID, was in emergency break glass, and it was stick to your rebalancing strategy. The board has adopted that strategic policy for a reason, and we want to stick to that through the good times and the bad times. And the nice part about a rebalancing strategy is it forces you to sell high and buy low. If equity markets run up and you hit up against that upper echelon or that upper boundary of the rebalancing range, you have to sell while markets are high, bring it back down into a nice range. Similarly, during COVID, when we hit the lower end of that, we were forced buyers of a low equity market.
Yeah,
So it's a really good policy to have in place.
and both of those are major behavioral risk issues for a lot of groups. It's like, you don't think about it a lot until it happens, and we've been through so many discussions where a market has sold off. This is the time. If this is your policy, this is the time you should be buying back in, and it's sometimes an arm wrestling match. So there's real behavioral items that come into play when it really hits the road like that.
Well, it also comes into play not just when markets go down.
Right.
When
Markets
you
go
get-
up.
when they
Absolutely.
go up.
You're a forced seller.
Yep.
But you're harnessing those returns when markets are high, right?
Mhm.
So having those rebalancing ranges well documented and well adhered to is key to a successful investment management program. Establishing procedures for investment services selection and performance monitoring. So when we go through and whether we're looking at a new investment for the fund, we want to have well documented processes in place there. How are we going to go about doing a manager search? How do we whittle that group down? Is it a public RFP? Is it a private RFP? How are we going about doing those different types of things? I think that's something that should be well documented in your IPS as well. Risk tolerances, risk is probably, if you counted up all the words that we've said today, risk is definitely going to be one that rises to the top. But we talked about the portfolio strategic risk levels, but then also you have to think about, from an implementation standpoint, how much active risk are you willing to take within the portfolio? So, an average pension fund will probably take somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.5% to 2% tracking error to their strategic policy. Generally speaking, when you look across different asset classes, and this goes back to the investment philosophies, where do you want to take that tracking error? Is that tracking error going to be taken in large cap US equity? Is it going to be taken in specialty credit, high yield, small cap international equity, emerging market equity? Those are pieces where you want to lay out philosophically where you think you're going to take that active risk budget. And as I mentioned, kind of on the onset of it, this document is going to be, a server of continuity for board, staff, consultants, anybody that's going to be looking at this fund will be able to read this document and have a thorough understanding of how this investment process is really governed by looking at the IPS. If we go to the next slide, we talked a little bit about fiduciaries a little bit earlier, but I just want to point out that every board member here, us as Wilshire serving you as a consultant, we are all fiduciaries. And what is a fiduciary? And really the word fiduciary, it comes from the Latin word trust, right? So if you read that second bullet point, a fiduciary is a person or organization that acts on behalf of another person or organization and is legally and ethically bound to act in their best interests. So that means I essentially have to put any opinions, any potential monetary gain, anything like that aside, and I have to do what's in your best interest. So if we think about other fiduciaries just outside of this room, you could say your doctor is a fiduciary. They have to put your best interests ahead of anybody else. Your real estate agent, if you go out and sell a house, they have to put your best interests in place. So there's many different examples of fiduciaries in everyday life, but I just want to point out that everybody in this room is a fiduciary to this plan, the CERS plan, and we have to put the plan ahead of all other interests in this room. So if you look at any person who, we kind of give you three different examples here, exercises any discretion or authority, control over the management of a pension plan or the management of the disposition of plan assets, that could be the board, that could be the investment committee, that could be asset managers, that could be the consultants. We're all fiduciaries from that perspective. Provides investment advice for a fee or compensation. Wilshire, your investment managers, we're all fiduciaries to the plan. Or has discretion of the assets within the pension plan. That could be staff if they're managing internal management of the plan. Discretionary advisors, those would also be fiduciaries. Those are all people that have to put the plan's best interest in place. So when we're thinking about, an IC meeting coming up or a board meeting coming up, I know Sherry sends out all of the materials a week beforehand. We all have a duty to make sure we know what is going to be in that packet and come prepared and be ready to answer any questions and act in the best interest of the plan in that meeting. Fiduciary responsibilities, I think we've kind of hit this a little bit, but there's a few ideas on here, and that's the duty of loyalty. We have to put all of our other external events aside. Our duty of loyalty is to the plan. And the prudent person rule is that we basically have to act with the care and skill and prudence of a diligence under the circumstances then prevailing that a prudent man acting in that capacity would kind of take under for the plan itself, which essentially means we cannot be mavericks here. We have to be prudent in the way we invest assets. We can't just all of a sudden, go all in chips to the middle because we feel really good about a particular investment. We want to diversify the portfolio. We want to make sure we are insulating it as best possible from drawdowns, knowing that there are going to be drawdowns, but we want to try to position the portfolio for long-term success.
And I think an important point there, and to kind of skirt it around the edge of this for a bit, is that we're not necessarily, or no one's going to get every decision right. It's important to have this governance framework in place to make sure that you're making informed decisions and weighing the risk and return and making the best effort to make the right decision. Even if it turns out later that it didn't work out, did you have a process in place? Is it documented? Did you follow it to make that decision? So if an investment blows up and causes a loss, it's a totally different scenario if a procedure was followed and the risks were understood and it was part of a diversified portfolio and had its role to play and everyone was on board, versus if you got into something outside your procedures without understanding the risks and it behaved in that same way. The outcomes are very different based on the procedure you followed to get there. You could have been a totally prudent person to make that decision with the information you had at the time, and it just didn't play out, versus you walked into something you didn't understand and then it blew up in your face, and that's when you really get into trouble. So it's about making the best decision you can make with the information you have at the time. No one's expecting you to know today, 5 years ago, that you should have just put everything in NVIDIA, right? That's just not reasonable. You took the information you had at hand, you made the decision to diversify risks so that you had the best possibility, given the information you had, to succeed over the long run. So a prudent person isn't necessarily some sort of clairvoyant. It's someone who takes the information at hand and follows a procedure, make a good decision given what they know at the time.
I would add, based on my training anyway, it's always been pointed out, not having a procedure is worse than not following one in some cases.
Yeah.
So, sometimes you run into situations where, well, we're better off not putting it in writing. I don't think we live in that world anymore.
Right.
Yeah, and those policies and procedures similar to the IPS are what, they allow you to fulfill your fiduciary duty. And I would point to, Craig's right here in the prudent person rule, but I'd also, it's the UPIA Act, right, which is the Uniform Prudent Investor Act, which kind of extends the old prudent person rule, especially for trustees of trusts. And that's pretty important, and exactly to the point that they've made, that you're acting for the sole benefit of the beneficiaries. You're relying on information to make decisions. Those are some of the important tenets, and those policies in the IPS and other policies and procedures are what allow you to fulfill that fiduciary duty.
So the duty to monitor, obviously the board makes a decision. We set a strategic asset allocation. The staff works with consultant. We work on implementing the portfolio. We do have a duty to monitor, make sure that those service providers are behaving and providing the results in line with what they were hired for. So we can't just be in a set it and forget it mode. We do have to have a duty to have ongoing monitoring of all of the investments within the portfolio. And there's going to be a section a little bit later. We'll talk about benchmarking and things like that. And then I want to say duty of disclosure, and this is, something where I think Mr. Cheatham a little bit earlier mentioned that there was a research meeting a little bit earlier, and you totally disclosed about how that relationship came to bear. Mm-hmm. And I just had a very simple example right here where, if somebody in the board maybe had a family member working in an investment manager, I think they would have a duty to disclose that relationship when that manager is being brought forth for a recommendation. They may even have to recuse themselves from being able to vote from something like that. So those are duties of a fiduciary to the plan. Next slide, we talk about the prudent person a little bit more here.
Before we go to that slide, can
Sure.
we come back to these responsibilities for just a second?
Sure.
I think it might be important to, at some point, in some form or fashion, outline how we address these particular responsibilities for the CERS system. We might be able to do some of that in the strategic plan. Some of it, the monitoring and the disclosure may get addressed in the IPS, but more than just telling us what we should do, I think it's important to talk about how we have actually addressed these responsibilities for the CERS system.
I think that's a good point, Ms. Pendergrass. The one thing I would state is, as we go into the IPS review, and once we do have a new IPS, I would say from a compliance perspective, we should be looking at everything that's mentioned in the IPS, and that should be part of your compliance reporting process, making sure that we are following those kind of statutes and rules, if you will, that you lay out in the IPS. That should be part of your compliance report that is presented to the board each quarter.
And that, I would think that would fall back to both the compliance officer and hopefully risk management officer.
Yes, indeed. And we're happy to help with that as well. That's something that we work with clients as well, is just making sure that we're adhering to the compliance of the IPS. So when we think of prudent person standards for investments, appropriate consideration when investments are brought to the IC or the board, how does it fit into the strategic policy that's been adopted? Does it meet the liquidity, risk, and return profile of the plans, provide ample cash flow? How is the structuring, the sizing of the investment been determined? Those are all things that should be considered when bringing in an investment to the portfolio. And Craig mentioned on this a little bit earlier, fiduciary duties focus on the procedures that are followed, not the outcome of their actions. So it's really documenting and outlining the process, making sure that it's followed. If anybody has question, if a procedure was followed, it should be raised in an IC or a board meeting to make sure that that's covered appropriately. It's really having that kind of protection, if you will, documented and followed, that's going to be key for good governance. And then if you are not an expert within a particular area, and I don't think any board or trustee member here is going to proclaim to be an expert in every field that you have to deal with in your responsibilities as a board member, you are allowed to delegate those responsibilities or seek advice from investment professionals such as your consultant, such as your actuary. And that's part of your duties as a fiduciary to make sure that you're doing that. Any questions on any of those topics? Okay.
All right, we move to the next page on benchmarking. This gets into the weeds a little bit, but that's based on past meetings and conversations and questions that have come up. But from a high level, benchmarking is important as part of that feedback loop that we've mentioned a few times. You put out these objectives and procedures and make decisions, and monitoring that is a very important part of this continual process that you need to be doing. And so benchmarking the portfolio, the managers, the composites, all the way up to the total fund is an important component of that monitoring. And the thing that's come up a few times has been this idea of public versus private benchmarking, and most recently it's been because of the big disparity between private equity returns and the public market proxies that are used to benchmark them. And I think Steve in a recent meeting did a good job explaining that. But just as a reminder, public markets typically have there's a series of rules to what makes a good benchmark, and it was pounded in my head when I was going through the CFA program, and most of that has leaked out over time. But I remember the main tenets of it, and that is that you want, in the best case scenario, you want a benchmark that's one of the key tenets is investable. So it's not a very good benchmark if you can't actually go invest in it. And sometimes we are forced to take these non-investable benchmarks as a representation of the exposure we're trying to get. So for example, private equity, it's tough to benchmark. There's not really an index that you can go out and say this is an index. Usually those indexes are largely based on peers, so they're more of a peer group than an index. So we say something like, well, we understand there's liquidity and risk in private equity that's not in public equity, so we hope to get a premium over public equity. So our benchmark is the Wilshire 5000 plus 3%. That's not investable. If it was, I'd just go out and sign up for that index and save myself the trouble. But when we evaluate these investments against indices, we have to understand what those indexes represent if we're going to fulfill our duty to monitor. So as far as private markets go, there's other measures that you can be looking at. In our quarterly and monthly materials, we're looking at time-weighted returns, but for private investments, dollar-weighted returns such as IRR are important to also take into consideration. You should be doing that on a regular basis, as well as looking at how those funds are performing against the other investments in the opportunities that are other funds that are in the peer group. Something else that you can look at is called a public market equivalent. So you take all the dollars and the timing of those dollars that you put into these private funds as they were drawing capital, and say, what if I put those exact same cash flows into a public market? What would the return have looked like? So that's another way to get an idea of how effective that decision to not just use that manager, but to use private strategies has been. And it's also very important to remember that we're looking at these over very long time frames. So as came up recently, over a 1-year period, if you're using a public market index against a private investment, it might be something that you note and then move on from and say, we're still looking at this over a 5 to 10 year period and the program's performing the way we wanted. We're not going to get hung up on the fact that over the last year, public markets are up 20+% and our private investments maybe haven't marked completely, maybe haven't kept pace with those markets that are trading every day. So This is something that is a bigger part of the IPS conversation, but again, we wanted to tee this up as something that everyone's thinking about as we go into that conversation, because it has been a topic of conversation in several recent meetings. And the last point here is very important. As I was kind of starting to say there, understanding the monthly and quarterly results is important, but the board needs to keep that long-term and high-level focus. And I think you guys do a good job of that. You get the IC gives an update on what they talked about, and they don't necessarily tell the board every little detail they went into, because the board, has other things on their plate and they need to stay high level. So the board has a responsibility to monitor, but it's important to make sure that it's monitoring and not getting bogged down in things that the IC and staff are staying on top of.
To the point of this last one, where we want to focus on the long-term objectives, and you think about performance over the longer term, making sure that shorter-term performance isn't driving reactionary movement in the portfolio. I was actually at a conference, and CIO actually stated that their performance report is backwards. So I thought that was really interesting. They list the 20-year, 10-year, 5-year, and the 1 year is the furthest thing. So the first thing they see are the longer time periods of how the portfolio is doing. Not that you should discount the 1 and 3 year performance, but let's keep our eye on the ball on the long-term objectives and the longer-term performance of the portfolio.
And if we move to the slide 14, just one last page to hit on. Again, this is another one where we won't get into the details of these topics today, but it's teeing up this conversation that's coming after it goes through the IC. It'll be coming back to the board, and that's the IPS, and tying it back to all these governance topics that we've discussed now. The main focus in the edits that we went through in redlining the IPS, and I know Vicki's had a chance to go help us clean up where we don't understand the statute, and she does, and make sure that that's all the T's crossed and I's dotted. Clear delineation of the roles and responsibilities. And we're not going to tell the board how much control to hand over or keep. That's a decision, sort of like the asset allocation decision, and how much risk to take, that you kind of have to feel out amongst the different members, and everyone might not feel exactly the same, but you come to a consensus, and that's how these decisions are made. Clear delineation of the roles. Then it's formally defined, the procedures and documentation for the processes. And then again, the lines of communication are very important here. So if you delegate any responsibility, you want reporting on how those decisions were made and when they were made, so that you can be making sure that you're doing the proper level of monitoring and understand what was done with the authority that you delegated. And it's also a good way for your stakeholders to stay informed as to what's going on too, that this part of this line of communication is to the public, so that people can understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. So more to come on the IPS. That's just teeing up, something that's going to be coming your way, and hopefully some of these topics we've covered to help you frame how you think about those potential changes when they come to you guys down the road here. And just want to open it up to any questions or further comments here.
We'll go back to slide 13, I think, or page 13 in board books, Sherry. Your top line, they're using the appropriate benchmarks. And I understand your point with regard to benchmarks that are not investable, I think is how you phrased it. That's obviously the case in some areas. In some areas, we're using benchmarks. I think we just got through making an adjustment to one of them from I think what S&P or down to
Oh, right.
index.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, that was not an IPS benchmark, but it was a portfolio benchmark, yes.
Well, that kind of goes to my question or thought. It seems to me like we need to be paying pretty close attention to what benchmarks we are using, and then which raises the question: if you've got a benchmark out there that let's just say, because I think on our private credit we're using a 50% high yield bond versus 50%. To what extent do we need to be managing that segment to match the benchmark versus the other way around?
It's a good question. When we modeled that asset class for the strategic asset allocation work, we used that 50-50 between our two assumptions, high yield and direct lending, leverage loans, private credit. When you go and you think about the implementation of that portfolio, and this would be a decision that I would think would be between board, investment committee, and staff who's going to make the decisions. You could certainly implement the portfolio outside of a 50-50 split between public and private, for lack of a better term. Those would be considered staff decisions or implementation decisions. So you are essentially taking a position, it's an active position, away from your strategic policy at that point. So you can actually attribute those results to those decisions, and that would be part of the monitoring process that we would be going through on a quarterly basis with you.
Yeah, to build on that, when you made the decision to employ X% of an asset class, when you went through the asset allocation from a high level, that's what you want to benchmark to. So like Chris said, the way we modeled those assets when we did the asset liability study, it suggested that if you take these public market proxies and add an illiquidity premium to it, that made it a compelling choice versus other options we had. So in the long term, we want to make sure, in the case of these private investments, if we have a benchmark plus an illiquidity premium, we want to make sure that we're getting that illiquidity premium, or maybe we have to revisit the decision to use private assets in those cases. So to your point, if we drill down to how the portfolio is implemented, that will depend largely on opportunity. So over time, you might not be exactly on that 50-50 split between high yield and loans, I believe, are the two components. But that's part of a decision that's been delegated, and the opportunity set. It's different than public markets where you can come back and say, well, your benchmark was the S&P 500, but you invested in a whole bunch of small cap that was tactical. This, with private markets, you're going to tend to have more swing around that target because of the funds that are in market and how the capital is drawn. You don't have perfect control.
From a monitoring standpoint, then it would seem to me like, to some degree anyway, you would want to adjust that benchmark to match what you're actually doing.
If you do, then you're taking the implementation component out of the attribution away. You'd be essentially changing your policy benchmark to match your implementation, which we'd say is not the way to do it. You'd want to take that strategic asset allocation benchmark, in this case the 50-50, that would be included in your total fund policy benchmark. And then when we're evaluating the composite, obviously all the underlying managers are going to roll up, we're going to benchmark it against that 50-50. But we're able to look at the underlying investments, what their benchmark is, and roll it up so we can understand what the implementation of the differences are between the two.
Right, it's effectively another one of many areas where you have an active risk decision, because you could have that 50-50 benchmark in this particular case where it's two different types of assets that are coming together. And if you said we want no risk around that 50-50, then you need to keep them at 50-50. But if you're willing to have some fluctuation around that, with the idea that that may produce returns that are worthy of taking, letting it be 40-60 for a period of time or vice versa, those are decisions you can make.
Two pieces in there. One, the private credit, that's an illiquid asset class. So to stay right on 50-50 is going to be very, very difficult. The other thing is, and I think Steve would agree here, they're going to have views between high yield and specialty credit and where they think the opportunities are. It's not to say the board of the IC shouldn't maybe consider what the guardrails, just like you're doing rebalancing within strategic.
That's actually where I was headed, and not specific to the private credit benchmark, but it's a good example considering all the discussions we've had. Does the IPS need to be that specific on an asset class by asset class basis?
Not necessarily, because that would be like going into public markets and putting boundaries on countries, putting boundaries on sectors. I don't think you need to get to that level. But if from a risk management perspective, you wanted to put ranges around what is acceptable and not acceptable within that bucket,
Risk level.
I would say on an
We
allocation.
do it on an exposure. We typically, I mean, we do that with other asset classes, exposures to sub-asset classes, constraints on or limits on sub-asset classes, which in an overall. Remember, these asset classifications have evolved over time. If we look at public equities, remember at one point we had a target for U.S. and a target for non-U.S. We moved to that MSCI ACWI index. And although none of the underlying managers actually manage against that MSCI ACWI index, the subcomponents roll up to give us an exposure that we manage, and we take views on whether we want to lean towards U.S. or non-U.S. relative to what that ACWI index might be. But this is not unique to one asset class. This is across most of our asset classes: real estate, real return. U.S. CPI plus 3% is not an investable index. there's not an instrument out there that we can do. But I would think we could certainly establish sub-asset class ranges or constraints within those larger overall asset class allocation targets.
Yeah,
I think that would make sense.
Steve is a really good example, because in terms of publicly traded global equity, it's constantly moving. How much of that is represented by the U.S. market and how much is represented by markets outside of the U.S. So that's a really good example of that. You have a benchmark that reflects the global weighting, adjusting all the time. And you'll be underperforming or outperforming that benchmark, and there are different things that add up to the reasons why, the attribution. And one of those will be, well, we were overweight U.S. when it did worse than non-U.S., or the way around.
And you could even simplify your specialty credit, because it is 20% and it's a 50-50 weighting. You could think of those as individual line items of 10% high yield, 10% specialty credit. And just like in the rest of the rebalancing ranges, you could put rebalancing ranges around those underlying components, which I think is what Steve's saying. It just comes down to how much implementation delegation you want to give within that particular credit, because it's not line item by line item right now. It's just specialty credit. How much implementation leeway do you want to give Steve and Anthony to implement that business?
Things you want to tie their hands and you won't have to, but you do
Correct.
need to put those bumpers in place, as you said.
In the same way that it goes back to your risk budgeting question, in the same way with take an equity manager, they have a mandate as well as to how much risk they can take within the portfolio from sector exposures or particular stocks being a particular percentage of that mandate.
But I do think it would be appropriate. I mean, I think that's completely reasonable to establish some type of constraints on those sub-asset classes within that overall larger asset class allocation.
Steve, would you do it by the sub-asset class, or would you do it based on a risk matrix of that particular asset class?
I think the easiest and probably the best
high yield where your risk is, for some period of time versus private credit. Does that make sense?
You are, and I think the most straightforward way to do it, and the way we'll typically see it, there's in different systems will do it different ways. I think in exposure, a market value exposure basis is the most straightforward to do it, the cleanest, the most understandable, and one that is typically not going to, the underlying metrics won't change over time either. So it's once it's established, it's easy to monitor.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. This all, I think this all leads to things to consider for the IPS, and as we've all already been working on that quite a bit, just process that, because these are some really good things to think about, whether they go in the IPS and how they're structured, and then also that feedback loop. Steve's talking about an exposure report, things like that, to say you put some guide some guidelines around that split between high yield and specialty credit. Here they are, and then just have regular reporting.
That's a great point there, because in our quarterly reporting, we have specialty credit and we show where the range is on that slider. We are not breaking that down between high yield and specialty credit. If you were to put something like that into the IPS, that's a great example that should be something that we monitor, and it's part of a compliance report down the line.
Yep. Any other thoughts, questions? We certainly hope that has been helpful, and hope that it's helpful as you just prepare to come onto the IPS and think about how all of those issues are addressed and structured.
I just add, if there's any questions that come up a day from now, a week from now, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're happy to get on a call or answer emails and address any questions you might have as a follow-up.
As we get into the IPS, I really want to thank you guys for making yourselves available and coming down and doing this. As you said earlier, none of us are an expert in all these different areas. And as we get into them, it's really beneficial to have sessions like this so that it's fresh on our mind as we dig into it and make our way forward. So I really do appreciate it. Y'all do a fantastic job, and I appreciate making yourselves as available as you do. That tends to be rare these days sometimes. So
we appreciate that feedback.
I do greatly appreciate it. Ed, you got any other questions?
No.
Okay. No. Anybody else have questions? Ryan, I want to thank you I know you've had a busy day already, just taking the time to step in.
Thank you. Sorry I was a little late. A lot of legislative meetings today, but very productive, and appreciate the part I got to sit in.
Good to see you.
Sir.
Okay. With that, I'm gonna, I was kind of delaying around waiting for Dr. Hackford to get back, but I'm sure he'll get back in here when he can. I've always been reluctant to ever make recognitions or awards or anything like that to sitting members of council or boards or any of that nature, but I wanted to do this one simply because I think it's very important. A lot of you guys have been around here for a number of years, directly connected to KPPA or KRS back in the old days. I know Mike's been in this fight for several years. JT down there, Betty, Bill, all of you. If you don't know the history of how we got to separation, it's hard to appreciate where we've been and where we are now. But I did want to, and I'm sorry she's not here with us, but I did want to recognize Miss Betty with a plaque. And Betty, it'll be here waiting for you whenever you come to the next meeting. But I wanted,
Sure, I'll make a special trip for a plaque.
I wanted to recognize Betty as being the inaugural chair of the CERS board. Being the first at anything, I think is worth recognizing, and I appreciate all the work she has done and all the work she continues to do and all the work she will continue to do, because when you're starting something from scratch, and we're spending time here talking about working on the IPS, yeah, it is a living document, but we didn't even have a living document to start with when it came to bylaws or IPS or anything else. And I just thought it'd be well worth recognize Betty for being there and doing that work and getting all that stuff started. And thank you, Betty, and we appreciate you and appreciate all your advice and guidance and thoughts, and we continue to look forward to working with you.
Thank you so much. It was definitely a team effort. It's not something I could have done by myself, but it was nice to be recognized, and I certainly appreciate that. I definitely have a continued interest in how successful we are at managing this pension system. Thanks.
Okay. With that, I will adjourn the meeting. I appreciate you all making the time, and particularly Mike and JT for making the long drive up.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Conversation.
Yeah.
Well, like I said, I live in Mexico. I don't have to come to you.